Do you ever get the feeling that you've missed something? Something a bit obvious? Well, the answer is yes. I did get a new haircut. Also, the old lathe is... well, it's gone. I'm sure a lot of you expected that this day would come, but between you and me, I really wasn't planning on replacing the lathe anytime soon. Especially after seeing how it performed after I put that 3 horsepower motor on it. I thought I'd get another year or two out of that lathe before replacing it. But at the end of the day, it was still a mini lathe, and there were just some things I couldn't do, especially machining big bar stock. And really, the only way out of that was to get, well, a bigger lathe. Now frankly, I'm still amazed that I was able to get it down to the workshop in one piece. Dragging a 180 kilo pallet over grass isn't exactly easy or quick. Took the better part of a day to do it with ratchets and pulleys. But it's here now and I'm really excited. Now before I go any further, I do want to point out that this wasn't planned with or sponsored by Hafco in any way. I do buy a good chunk of my tooling from them, but that's mostly because they have a warehouse not too far from me that I can go and pick my stuff up from. And as far as their involvement in this video was simply them taking the money out of my bank account and them loading the lathe into the car. Speaking of which, the lathe in question is a Hafco Al 250G. It's roughly a 10x20 bench lathe. It's bigger than the old one, but small enough to fit in the workshop. So let's get it unboxed and see what we have. Nah, I'm just kidding. Well, thankfully it looks like it got here in one piece. Also, it looks to be way bigger than I remember it was in the store. Really nice to be working on a big lathe again. Looks like we have a mystery box of tools. My favourite type of mystery box. I'm going to go ahead and guess that's the chip tray. Yep, seems to be. Got some instructions. Overall, I'm pretty happy, and nothing seems to be jumping out to me as being a problem, which is a good start. Of course though, I can find out if there's any problems later, but first we need to get it on the workbench. Can't exactly use the lathe on the ground, although I would take that up as a challenge. Now I know the workbench that I'm using really isn't the most suitable for bolting a lathe to it, but upgrading it really wasn't in the budget, at least this time around. It's at least rated to hold the weight of the lathe and a little bit more than that. Of course though, lifting a 160 kilo lathe really isn't as straightforward as lifting a mini lathe. I had to rent out an engine hoist, which seemed to do the job just fine. Of course though, because I did rent out an engine hoist, once the lathe goes down, it's not moving anywhere for a very long time. And the lathe seemed to go down quite easily. Although we did manage to lose a little bit of paint. Alright, so let's talk about the... Sorry about that, I forgot these things are 90% grease when they ship them. That's where the real value is. So let's talk about the lathe. It's a Hafco Al 250G. It's a 250 by 500 bench lathe. So the biggest part this lathe can swing is 250mm in diameter, and the longest part it can hold between centres is 500mm. It's not that much more bigger than the old lathe, but in terms of its overall mass and its features, it leaves the old lathe in its tracks. Obviously, I don't do a huge amount of large work, but just having that extra mass will go a long way into helping make better parts and make my life a little bit easier. Now, the old lathe was roughly 40 kilos, give or take, and this one here is 160, 165-ish. Still relatively light for a lathe, but that is a huge step up and improvement, and that should really help dampen vibrations. However, it's not just the extra mass that you get for your money, you do get quite a lot of features that the old lathe was lacking. For one, you do get properly hardened ways. It's still going to be cast iron, but that cast iron has been induction hardened, and that's going to offer better protection against damage and wear. Compare this to, say, the mini lathe. The mini lathe bed wasn't hardened, and after 4 and a bit years of use, one end was slightly more worn than the other. It wasn't a huge issue yet, but it certainly was going to become one in a few years' time. So in effect, having hardened ways should hopefully prolong the lifespan of the lathe. It's also nice to see the tailstock use separate V's to the carriage, which should hopefully keep the wear separate and the wear low. Another big step up compared to the old lathe is this big carriage and cross slide. There's a huge amount of material in both of them, and they should hopefully put up with the bigger machining forces. And the compound is so much nicer than the old one. It does need a bit of adjusting on the gibs, but it's really nice to have a working compound again. It's also great to have a working thread dial, because the old lathe didn't have one. Obviously, I don't do a huge amount of single point cutting, but in case I do, it's great to have it. Okay, before I move on, let me quickly find the handwheel knobs. Fingers crossed they're in here. If not, we already have a project on our hands. Okay, so it looks like they included a number 4 Morse dead center. And this will be a number 3 dead center for the tailstock. My guess is they're included for turning between centers. They did include a faceplate, which I have right here. So I'm guessing the faceplate bolts to the spindle nose, and the live centers go into the headstock and tailstock. And from there you can turn work between centers. Pretty unlikely that I'll ever do it, but it's nice to have it on hand. And the faceplate's going to need a bit of cleaning up too. Okay, that's going to be a chuck key, spanners, looks like the outside jaw for the 3-jaw chuck, keys, for whatever reason. Looks like they did include the knobs, thankfully. And it looks like a T-spanner for the tool post bolts. That's definitely a lot better than it was before. Alright, so as you can probably tell, we do have a proper power feed. The right lever is obviously for threading, that will engage the half nut, but the left lever is for a proper power feed. Now if I've read it correctly, it's down for the power feed and upwards for the power cross slide. Obviously it's a lot more fun to move the carriage by hand, but it's pretty useful to have one of these on hand. As good as I think I am at moving the carriage, the power feed is going to be more consistent and it should provide a much better surface finish. And unlike the threading, which uses a half nut to tap power, this will tap power off the lead screw via a worm gear and a keyway, although I'm not exactly sure which one does which. We've also got a cover for the lead screw to keep the chips off, and that's really useful to have. Now all of that is going to be driven directly from the headstock, and if I'm completely honest, this is the feature that made me decide to buy this lathe compared to some of the other models that I was looking at. Both the spindle and the lead screw are fully gear driven, and both of them are connected to proper gearboxes. So like a big lathe, all of the pitches and speeds are going to be selected by these two levers, anywhere from 0.25mm up to 2.5mm, and that should allow me to cut any standard metric thread from M1 to M22, or if I really wanted to, a fine pitch M33 bolt. And that's all without having to do a single gear change, and for me, that is really worth paying for. I probably can't do any imperial threads anymore, but realistically, I only had to do it about 3 or 4 times on the old lathe, and in any event, if I ever have to do any imperial thread cutting, I'll just buy a tap and die. The gearbox also sets the power feed, which as you can probably see, the speeds are much better suited for power feeding than threading. Of course though, it's not only the lead screw that has a proper gearbox, but also the spindle, as opposed to it being continuously variable. And you know, there are pros and cons to this. Obviously for one, you are limited to the 12 available gear speeds, anywhere from 80 to 1600 RPM. But it is 12 speed, and there is a good range of speeds here, so honestly, I'm not too worried. It's also going to be louder than a pulley driven spindle, but really when you're machining, the machining sounds are going to be louder than the spindle, so honestly I'm not too worried. In return though, you do get the advantage of having a mechanical gear reduction, which can make even a small motor very powerful. This for example only has a 1 horsepower motor, which is only a third of that of the old mini lathe, but if I run it at say 700 RPM, we're going to double the torque, since the motor runs at 1400. Obviously that won't be 100% efficient, but you can probably see how much torque we're going to get. That also means when we're threading at say 80 RPM, we're going to have 17.5 times the torque, which means absolutely nothing is going to be able to stall this lathe. Compare that to say a DC motor, which is very easy to stall out at low RPM. And to me, that's what makes this way more worth it than having a continuously variable spindle. Plus the electronics are going to be a lot more simple, and they won't go bust after only a year. Now obviously it is still being driven from pulleys, but that's only from the motor to the gearbox. And there's also a gear train going down from the headstock to the secondary gearbox. But thankfully we don't have to touch or modify either of them. The spindle bore is also only 26mm in diameter, which is probably in part to the number 4 Morse taper, but honestly I would have expected it to be a little bit bigger than that. I also have to say just how nice it is to have a big chuck to work with. This one here is 130mm in diameter, which is 50mm bigger than the old one. Just better clamping power and a larger range, especially on the inside jaws. I think this is going to hold 55mm stock before I have to flip to the outside jaws, compared to I think 32 on the old chuck. Now this is a Sano chuck. I've owned 2 of them and I've used a few of them in the past, and they're okay. They're nothing special, just okay, but I think they will work for this lathe. It also came with a steady rest and a follower rest, but for whatever reason, it isn't machined square from the casting. Functionally, this will be fine, but it is going to annoy me. Also, let me quickly pause again, because I do need to remove that backsplash, which is something that I've done to pretty much every lathe that I've ever owned. People ask me why I do this, and it's mostly a consequence of filming all of this. The backsplash has always made it a lot more difficult to light the chuck and the workpiece, and frankly, I'm not a huge fan of seeing that grey in the background of my shots. I will though need to make a cover for the motor, just to stop stuff getting in there. The chip guard is also a nice thought, but it also gets in the way of filming, so that goes too. And the same thing goes for the chuck safety guard, although I'm sure a lot of people removed that too. Now the guard, as it closed, also activated a switch which stopped the lathe from turning on if the guard wasn't down, so that's going to need soldering up too. Well, that's the inside of a geared lathe head. Not really sure what I was expecting, but it's quite impressive. Don't know how we can see down there, but there is a pool of oil in the bottom. Plus there is an oil glass on the front and behind the chuck. From what I can tell, the oil looks good, so I'm not going to replace it anytime soon. The gear changes are also a little bit sticky, but I'm hoping that in time they will loosen up a bit. Okay, I was about to say how nice it was to have a carriage dial again. The mini lathe just didn't have one, but am I going mad, or is the dial showing that the carriage moves 15.5mm per revolution? Obviously, it's probably down to the ratio of the rack and pinion, but 15.5mm per revolution just sounds odd. The cross-slide dial also reads for diameter, not radius, which is not hugely uncommon, but it is the opposite of what it was on the mini lathe. So it'll take a bit of getting used to, but in actuality, what I might just end up doing is installing a DRO. Alright, so let's get it started. It's definitely louder than the old motor, but it's not unreasonable. I don't really have a quick change tool post that is suited to this size lathe, so I'll stick with the 4-way tool post and use some shims. Just a bit of hot rolled steel. Okay, so that was a 4mm depth of cut, and it seemed to handle it just fine. And that was 1.5mm, and that was pretty easy. Okay, let's try some power feeding. And that looks much nicer than what I could achieve hand feeding. And just to see what would happen, I've installed the old quick change tool post from the mini lathe. Really is a bit small for this. And I can already see there's some flex and deflection. Yeah, no chance that I'm doing that again, it just wasn't rigid enough. Now in fairness, it really wasn't meant for this size lathe, and it's better suited for a mini lathe. Let's try a little bit of 4140. Okay, that seemed to handle it quite easily, and it turned up a really good surface finish. Okay, that was 0.5mm, and the surface finish came out even better. And whilst I think of it, let me check the spindle. Now according to the indicator, I'm getting about 0.06mm of run out. That's about 2.5 thou. It's a bit more than I was hoping for, but that's sort of what you'd expect from an import 3-jaw chuck. And good lord, that chuck needs to be pulled apart and cleaned. It seems to be full of grit and grinding dust, and that's not really what you want to see in brand new equipment. And thankfully it's only 3 bolts to remove the chuck. And we're getting about 0.01mm of run out on the spindle. It's pretty funny though, you can tell which faces are critical and which ones aren't, because the ones that are nicely ground in, and anything that isn't is left, well, as machined. Not the biggest issue, but it would have taken, 5 seconds, just to make those other surfaces look a little bit nicer. Alright, so let me quickly clean up the chuck before I pop it back on the lathe. And thankfully, there really isn't much to cleaning these chucks. And it looks like they haven't used any grease or oil, so I guess it's a good thing that I am taking it apart. Probably helps to take the jaws out first. Alright, so I have no clue why there's blue paint on the back of the scroll, but thankfully most of it will come off in a bath of terps. And after a quick deburr and a light dab of oil, it goes in a lot nicer than it did before. Now, I'm not sure how everyone else does it, but every time I've rebuilt a chuck, I've used oil on the front of the scroll and where the jaws go in and out, and I've used grease on the back. The grease will stay in place and the chips don't tend to get into the back, and the grease seems to work. And I will mention now that the method of securing the chuck to the spindle ain't the greatest. Yes, 3 bolts is pretty simple, but actually doing it in practice is pretty difficult. I think it took about 10 minutes, plus a busted finger, to get the chuck on. Finally, let's try some 42mm steel. I got my hand on a Morse taper sleeve, so I can use my old Morse taper 2 tooling. And that was a 1/2 mil depth of cut. It seemed to be pretty happy with it, but I think the feed was a little low. Might try bumping it up. Okay, so it didn't like 0.7, but once I backed it off to 0.5, it was a lot happier. And that's a surface finish I can be really proud of, especially in hot rolled steel. Well, overall, I'm really impressed. As much as I really liked that mini lathe, and that thing was a beast, this thing is just a big step above that. Does need a bit of deburring, but overall, I'm really happy with the purchase. Now, between you and me, I wasn't really planning on doing a huge amount of upgrades to this lathe, but having gone over it, I do have a small list of upgrades that I want to do. Just a few things that will make using it a little bit easier over the next 5 or 10 or however many years I own this lathe. Obviously it's not perfect and it is a compromise, but for me it's a solid platform and I should be able to make some really good parts with it over the next few years. And of course I have to say a big thank you to everyone who's watching this video. I obviously couldn't justify buying a big lathe like this if it wasn't for everyone who was watching and supporting my videos, so a big thank you to you. Thanks for watching.